It's very exciting to have so many people join us today. An interesting day to well, any day in January is of an election year. Following an election year is always going to be an interesting day to have a policy conversation. It's going to be especially interesting today. We're very excited to get to your questions. But first, I want to introduce Tracy Bruckner, our Chief Policy Officer. Tracy is hails from rural Nebraska. She brings 2 decades of experience in public policy to WLA. And prior to joining the WLA team late last year, Tracy was working on private policy consulting after working with the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders Network. And we're just really glad to have Tracy here as we navigate the policy environment of this incoming Congress and federal administration. And she will be in dialogue today with our CEO, Leslie Allison. Hi, Leslie. Most of you, if not all, know Leslie, I'm sure. But Leslie and Tracy are going to be chatting initially together just to cover all of our bases on the policy environment right now. And then we will open it up to questions. Oh, hello. And so I just want to go over a few things here for folks who are joining. We made this a meeting, so you are all able to join us and have your voices heard during our question and answer period. So we're really excited to have you and be in dialogue with you, our members. WLA is a membership-based organization that is landowner-led and founded, and we work to advance policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species in the West. If you can't recite that from memory now, I hope that as a member you'll just hold it to heart. But we really are a membership-driven organization. So your support, your engagement in everything from our policy work to the stewardship practices you put on in practice on your land every day is what makes us go. So we're really excited to have you here and engage in this conversation with us. I'll just ask that if you're not talking, that you be muted so that we don't have distractions that throw us off. So if you can do that, that'd be great. And then if you do have a question during the question and answer period towards the end of the conversation, we'll obviously prompt for that. You're welcome to add that in the chat if that's easiest. If you want to, make sure that we get to it or bring it up in advance of that time. If you have a clarifying question you'd like us to get to right away, go ahead and you can drop that in the chat. That's the easiest way to do it. But you're also welcome to raise your hand, and I can unmute you or ask you to unmute as an invitation to hear from you during that period. And then we want it to be as dialogue as possible, but there are 50 of us now on the call, so it's always difficult to do that to avoid having people break in. So if we can just try to manage that as best we can, I'm happy to help. And you're always welcome to chat with me directly if you've got a technological issue that's happening in the background. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy and Leslie to get going on the meat of this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. I'm super excited to be introducing you to Tracy. I'm incredibly excited to have Tracy on board with us and bringing an enormous wealth of expertise to our efforts and in service to you all and the things that we all represent here. So look forward to that introduction. I hope you all during and after will feel free to reach out. We are landowner-led. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to know what your concerns are, your interests, things like that. That's how we do our work. We're in quite a moment right now, and in a moment like this, there are opportunities. There are a lot of concerns, of course, right now for nonprofit organizations like us, waking up to the federal freeze right now on funding. If you all aren't aware of that, you can check out the recent administration order to freeze all federal grants and aids. We are looking hard at what that might mean for us and how that will affect us. I think right now it looks to affect perhaps about 30% of our budget. And a lot of it will impact the money that was actually going to go out on the ground to our members, ranchers, farmers, watershed improvements. We're very hopeful that that is a temporary pause and that we'll resume work under those grants here in short order. But it is a time of uncertainty. And what we will do is what we have always done with Western Landowners Alliance, which is that we will hold true to the values that we care about, to the needs and interests of you all, of our landowners, and our work to try to keep the working lands of the West whole and healthy for all of our benefit for future generations. And that requires that we do as much as we can to bring people together and not drive people apart. That's what we've always done. We consider ourselves a radical center organization in that regard, a big tent, that we are a place where healthy dialogue and debate can take place, where we try to look at all sides of an issue and then try to find a path forward. And often we really look to collaborative processes to help us do that. And I've been amazed in my time with Western Landowners Alliance just how much the right kind of processes can yield paths forward when it wasn't at all clear that there would be a path forward. And so that's where we are leaning in, is to the many people that want to see a positive future for the West and to the processes that can get us there. There is, always change, always uncertainty with the new administration. Our policy platform, as Tracy will talk about, is built on years of engagement with the landowner community. It doesn't change with a change in administration. There may be some nuance in how we message it, how we think about it, and some of the tactics that we'll try to use depending on what's happening. But anyway, that's what I wanted to sort of say at the outset as I introduce Tracy. And the other thing that I will say that is personally very helpful for me in any time of change and uncertainty is that it's reacting doesn't always benefit us in many ways. What I find much better is to figure out how to lead, how to move forward, how to see ahead and bring people together to defining what that path can be. And I actually think there's never been a better time for us to do that as a landowner community. The future of the West really is in our hands, and it will depend on us figuring out those paths forward together. And that leadership is deeply needed right now. And so we're excited to forge ahead with that. So with that, I will hand it over to Tracy.
Well, thanks, Leslie, and hello, everyone. It's really great to meet you all. If you want to show yourself on camera, that'd be great, so I can put faces to names, and when I see you in person, I'll remember. Anyway, thanks for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you all, and as I continue to get my feet under me here at Western Landowners Alliance. I started in December, and I've been drinking from the fire hose ever since. So I understand policy and the policy making process, but how policy applies in the West is opening me up to some new policy learning, and it's been really great. And I appreciate Leslie coaching me along on all I need to know, and I look forward to engaging with you all more in the future. So, as Leslie mentioned, we know there's a lot of change afoot, many of which we don't yet know what that impact is going to be, what it all entails. And so we planned this webinar to present to all of you what we're thinking about for our policy agenda based on what we know is needed to serve Western landowners, communities, and the wildlife that depend on private lands. There's going to be unknowable challenges in the disruption, and we're just keeping abreast of all that is happening. And so while we do not know what it will mean for the programs and our funding we care about, and the need to serve Western landowners and their conservation efforts, we are paying close attention, and we're going to continue to catalog what that means along the way. And we know that the WLA network is powerful, and we really plan to help engage you all in these policy conversations moving forward. So regardless of all the unknowns right now, we firmly believe that we need to continue to elevate the really incredible work that's happening across the Western landscape, and what everyone is doing to provide wildlife habitat, protect our soil and water, and most importantly, we need to keep pushing the conversation around depoliticizing conservation on working land and demonstrate that the desire for us to achieve sustainable prosperity while conserving our lands, water, and wildlife for the future generations. It's really common ground, it's a common ground, nonpartisan goal. And I don't think we're out in left field by sticking to that and talking about these issues and how they impact the West. So with all that, as we present kind of the policy platform that we're looking at, we know you're going to have questions. We want you to think about these issues as we're talking about them as a frame for how we're going to continue to position ourselves as policymakers and really operationalize that policy that works for the West. And so, like Leslie said, it's important to note these issues are not just created out of thin air. They've come from the years of experience and knowledge that WLA has in working directly on the ground with landowners, as well as some of our own staff being landowners themselves. So as we jump into it here, I just, one thing we've been thinking a lot about is around how we turn the narrative out there in the narrative that's really strong out there about how do we reduce bureaucracy and the cost to the federal government. How do we turn that narrative into opportunities for us to pursue our policy positions? And we think there's a real strong opportunity to position landowner-driven conservation as a solution that can shape the direction of federal conservation policy moving forward. So we think we can make the case for that by delivering federal investments directly to states and local communities who understand the needs more directly, that have the knowledge base and are working directly with people on the ground. So we think there's a lot of common ground in that, and that's kind of going to be the basis for how we frame up our policy. So Louis, if you want to share the PowerPoint now, and we can get into kind of where we are with things. All right, so if you want to advance to the next screen, sorry, Louis, I probably should have shared. So we're looking at federal policy platform, our guiding principles in the direction for policymakers. You can go to the next slide. So we're just setting out as the new administration gets on the ground and there's new members of Congress and in the committees, we want to offer these guiding principles to them. We really believe that they need to respect and prioritize working lands and the people who produce the food and raw materials and energy essential to all Americans. And recognize and support the critical role working lands and people who care for them play in sustaining the wildlife and the environment. So, one thing Leslie has talked to me a lot about since I've started is landowners should not be penalized for supporting imperiled wildlife. And we really need to look at what are the economic drivers that reward stewardship through models such as habitat leasing, for example. And we also believe that landowners, need there needs to be some support for the income that's lost and the property that's damaged related to supporting publicly managed wildlife, as well as energy development. And then we think there's a real opportunity to take a partnership-based approach. The working lands community needs to be engaged early and often, all along the way that the policies are being developed. And we're going to build that voice in not only DC, but at the state level as opportunities arise as well. We think maintaining federal investments through state and local partnerships that deliver that money closer to the ground can really help policy be more cost effective and more beneficial as well. So those are kind of our guiding principles. And from there, we're going to talk about the policy recommendations directly that we have. First and foremost, we really want to talk about how we strengthen the economic viability of working lands in rural economies. So you can go to the next slide, Louis. I love that picture, by the way. It's a fabulous picture. How do we improve how federal conservation programs are rolled out on the ground? That's one of the things we really want to talk to people about is, sometimes the delivery of those programs have not really been done that well, including the application process, negotiating around payments, and the reporting requirements that go with that. And again, we really want to support some environmental markets, and we think public policy has a role to play there, and public payments for the conservation stewardship. So the habitat leasing and building support mechanisms that can help us unleash a conservation trust fund, for example. What are the tax incentives that can support land stewardship too? Um, I mean, Congress is going to be doing a budget reconciliation process, and there's going to be a tax bill moving forward. Is that an opportunity to look at providing tax incentives for land conservation, including deductions as well as maybe transferable tax credits that support voluntary conservation easements and possibly other tax credits that support conservation on working lands? Okay, next slide. And then again, recognizing and supporting the role of private lands in conserving wildlife. You can go on to the next slide. Sorry, Lewis. Maybe these title slides are a little too much. But so we, I am so impressed with the incredible work that's been done through the Migratory Big Game Initiative that's been put out in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. I mean, that has really been incredible and really impressive. And I think we have a strong case to make for expanding that successful model. Shalise had shared with us in a report that she pulled together like 295% increase within the priority enrollment counties in the grassland CRP in Wyoming. It's because WLA came together and worked with NRCS to figure out how to make these programs stack and work better for people who are in those big game migratory areas. And that's really impressive. So I think we have a strong case to make with policymakers about expanding that. And again, continuing to support those practices that are needed in those areas, such as range riding and fencing and carcass management and more. And then I think we all know that we need to improve the Endangered Species Act, enhance the regulatory certainty, and provide some targeted funding that really, like maybe through the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, that can really help support landowners and farmers and producers and ranchers get ahead of the curve when it comes to protecting imperiled species so that we prevent the need for listing in the future. Okay, next slide. And if I'm going too quickly, I'm sorry. If there's any questions along the way, don't hesitate to just put those in chat or come off mute and ask any questions. And then also we're looking at the water resource management and drought and how we address those critical water resource issues. We really need, I think bottom line, there's some bullet points here for you to look at, but we really need to improve the capacity and how those programs are delivered and the technical assistance on the ground working with producers and landowners. And ultimately, we need consistent funding so that it encourages multi-year restoration projects. So, that's a case we're going to be making to policymakers too, is that the funding for these projects is really important, and some of that doesn't happen without the federal support and consistent federal support. Next slide. Looking at public lands management, we really want to figure out more about taking that. This is where we're really talking more about taking that partnership approach. We really think that's critical. You want to move to the next slide? Sorry. And, focused on increasing the grazing flexibility and accountability through outcomes-based grazing. I watched the film Against the Herd, and I think the lessons learned through that is really, really important in how we work to improve the grazing ability on public land. And then making sure we have the qualified and efficient service-oriented staff that can actually help those things happen on the ground. Oh, that was weird, Lewis. And, when it comes to energy development, we think that all forms of energy production should have the highest possible environmental standards. Planning for energy development, we think that it should include early and consistent engagement with affected grazing permittees and private landowners as well. And making sure that we're designing the project so that it supports multiple uses such as agrivoltaics. And then, of course, respect private property rights is really important. That kind of takes us to our platform. We have some specific Farm Bill recommendations that we're going to share out in follow-up. I didn't want to get into the weeds of all that. right now, but we will be sharing that with you in follow up to this call. Um, and I will say that, the Farm Bill, it's kind of uncertain what's going to happen with the Farm Bill and how that's going to move forward. They did pass an extension at the end of last year, but we are working with our partners and things to, we'll have to reintroduce some marker bills that we were supporting and get those back into the mix again. But it kind of remains to be seen how the Farm Bill will move forward. But we're going to keep pushing on that and pushing these priorities into the areas of policy where they need to be inserted. And Leslie, I just want to open it up for you to see if there's anything you want to add, anything I left out, anything important, any important messages there on that front.
No, I think you covered it really well, Tracy. Thank you. I think the only thing I would say is kind of touching back on the Endangered Species Act, which is always a very, very sensitive subject. And we have many different opinions on that within our membership and among our partner organizations. And the bottom line that we've always taken with the Endangered Species Act that we hear coming from a lot of landowners is the intent of the Endangered Species Act is something that we believe in very much. We don't want to see the Endangered Species Act eliminated by any means. There are ways in which the implementation of that act could be improved. It shouldn't punish landowners, as Tracy referenced. It should reward people. If you have a good species on your land that's imperiled, we should celebrate that and not be afraid that we're going to be put out of business. So some simple things like that. There are administrative things we can do. There are funding things we can do to help ease some of the friction that is generated by Endangered Species Act. And then quite honestly, there are things that could be improved in statute. There's fuzzy areas that lend themselves to endless litigation in the language, things like, what it means by, a substantial, a significant portion of a range, that species have to occupy that. We don't have a definition for that all the time. So there are areas, but there's been so much, political friction over that, finding the path forward that is going to be a win-win has been looked at as very challenging. We may see some new ESA legislation, I think, coming online here shortly, and we'll see where that goes. But I just wanted to clarify that from our standpoint, we don't want species to go extinct on our watch. We want the ESA to work to help species and also recognize the value of working lands, the critical importance of working lands, and the role that working lands play in wildlife conservation overall. So it's a nuanced effort. I'll just say that.
Thanks, Leslie. Well, I think we wanted to open up for questions and comments for a little bit, and then I was going to just talk about where we see the West having some influence on some of the key committees. So open it up for a few questions and comments, and then we'll just talk about that a little bit too.
Go ahead, Bill. You have to unmute. No.
A question always comes up talking about policy is leverage. And I was having a conversation with our working group here in Central Montana. We had our conservation committee and realizing our local groups really don't have the capacity to really invest like I think they need to in policy. And, Leslie, we've talked about this before. I'm just curious how Western Landowner Alliance is thinking about leverage and the capacity to connect dots. It's really difficult to do. But at the end of the day, if, like I look at just Central Montana, got a lot of ranchers that if they understood how to relate to policy, they probably have as much impact on the current administration than many people. And I don't know how best to do that. I just know it's an unmet need that we're still struggling to address.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that. Let's see, am I off mute here? I appreciate that. You're spot on with that. And the reason Western Landowners Alliance was created was to create that collective voice on these issues and on policies very specifically. And it takes a certain amount of capacity to connect all the dots across the West. It may be a small town with a large main street, but that main street does take a while to get around. And so capacity is one of the challenges. And then we need to continue to improve our engagement process so that, you and other groups, know how to engage with us as we build this kind of policy effort. And that's part of why we're doing, for example, this call today, is to invite that dialogue and invite that participation and input. And we're talking right now about more structural ways to connect those dots. So we do see a very core function of Western Landowners Alliance as unified policy work. That said, I can tell you it's challenging to fund that work. It's challenging to find the unity out there. And there's, within the ag community, there are a lot of differences of opinion. We don't always get along, one ag group to the other, agree on things. And so really finding that common ground and making it, substantial enough that it's really worth pursuing what we come out with in that common ground is sort of the first order of business. And then trying to throw folks' weight behind that in an effective way is the next challenge. And, for some people, it might mean picking up the phone and calling your congressman. It might be coming into a fly-in in DC. It might mean writing letters or doing sign-on letters. There's numbers of ways that we can, show our support behind one particular thing or another. So I would just invite you all to use Western Landowners Alliance as a collective voice. And we also know that many of you are involved with your stock growers organizations. It may be the Farm Bureau, it may be environmental advocacy organizations. Everybody's involved with different voices that are trying to do this. And, the extent we can bridge those efforts and find that common ground will be much more effective at leveraging the influence of this community in DC. It ends up being a lot of phone calls, I can tell you that, a lot of meetings, and it takes time and commitment and investment to do that. But hopefully we create an opportunity to support that. Bill, does that touch anywhere close to what you're asking?
No, it certainly does. And I totally appreciate the complexity and challenge and capacity to deal with this. But, one just simple request is like, listening to you guys' core principles and your highlighted focus areas. I could do this with RSA and ACES. Is just like, just communicate that document. And when they have their conservation committee, in fact, I was just talking about that with their conservation committee at ACES this morning. It's like, why don't we just take 10 minutes and at least let people know what other people are doing? And at least with that awareness, then maybe someone might pick up a call and call Tracy or something. And but it's a lot of little small steps that just creates a group like ACES having at least an understanding of what WLA is doing and how their work and capacity can benefit them, because they don't have the capacity to do what you guys are doing in DC. But translating your work to them doesn't have to require a huge amount of effort if we're strategic.
I love that input, Bill, and I'm so excited that we have Tracy here that is bringing us that capacity to be able to do that. So we'll definitely, and that's true for all of you all on the call. This is an invitation. If there are things you'd like to hear from us or ways we can engage with you or organizations you're working with, please reach out to us. We definitely want to do that and consider us the resource.
Thank you.
Louis, there were a couple questions.
I was going to read a question in the chat since we've got one from Judith Kohler. And she asks, the new administration wants to streamline and expedite oil and gas leasing and permitting on federal lands. How do you see landowners engaging on that issue?
You want me to take that, Trace?
I would appreciate that.
Yeah. So it's really unclear at this point how much that will expand right now. The gas prices, oil prices determine some of that expansion, and there may be some delay in that expansion if it happens. But I think this is the challenge, is that we don't like regulations when they're in our way, but we really like regulations when they help us fend off something we don't like. And so it's always trying to find the balance in those ways. And I think that maybe one of the answers there is, hopefully we'll see some reforms, and this touches on Tom's comment. I'd love to hear more from Tom there, but how we ensure that the permitting and leasing is done to the right level of responsibility and engagement without having it be completely bogged down in red tape. And so that's where all this conversation about NEPA comes in. Is there a way that we can do NEPA that is still effective, is expedited, but doesn't shortcut that critical input from affected stakeholders and landowners? And so I think that's going to be a big focus. I mean, which already is in Congress, it's going to continue to be a major focus. And there actually is, I think, quite a bit of consensus that the need for NEPA reform. It's just going to be a matter of how that happens. Local communities have some authority in how leasing plays out around them. Being engaged with your local communities about these issues is very important. Split estate is always a big question where, especially when the federal government owns the mineral rights under your land, and those mineral rights are dominant from a legal standpoint. That's profoundly challenging to landowners. We do have on our website some guidance for landowners in navigating some of the oil and gas development issues out there, particularly on the private lands. And we have developed, sets of recommendations before to influence how energy development moves forward. So I don't know if that then answers enough of your question, but Judith, if you have other thoughts or you want to ask more in depth, let me know.
Thank you.
Excellent. So Tom's question was thoughts on NEPA. You touched on it just a little bit there. That's a pretty broad question too. And I think you said you'd love to hear from Tom, but I can see, I think that Tom is having some trouble connecting his own microphone, at least last I saw. So if you're there, Tom, and you wanted to elaborate on your question, we'd welcome it. In the meantime, why don't I go to Jen Gigarelli, who is has her hand raised on the thing. Jen, want to unmute and punch me?
Decent job at that pronunciation of the last name. I'm calling in from Colorado and also driving through a valley, so hopefully you all can hear me. I appreciated what you shared about like the multi-use and especially with energy development. I know solar right now is a very hot and sometimes dirty topic here across our state with some prevailing sentiments, obviously around competition with agricultural lands, since they kind of target the same areas. My impression right now is that kind of pushing agrivoltaics forward seems mostly in the county's hands right now. I know we had a lot of counties having moratoriums in the past years, and they seem to be kind of building the plane while flying it when it comes to solar and agrivoltaics development. Do you see any opportunities for state policy work to further incentivize or also set barriers around solar development to try to promote agrivoltaics, given that there is such a huge hurdle to overcome with solar developers on the actual economics of installing something that can be agrivoltaics compatible versus agrivoltaics compatible versus just straight solar?
Yeah, I mean, I think there seems to be pretty strong support for agrivoltaic installations where that's feasible. I think that the dialogue with the energy companies, all energy companies and solar, of course, is if you create situations where you undermine your own social license to operate, or you increase your regulatory exposure. So let's say that you obliterate a bunch of wildlife, and now we're going to have more listings. I mean, we've got a pile of just pollinator listings alone coming in the next, 18 months, depending on, of course, what happens politically with the ESA. But the more land, the more habitat that's adversely impacted, the more wildlife that's adversely impacted, the more likely we're going to have, sort of ESA type related regulatory risk. The more you anger people in communities, take agriculture out, you're going to have potentially more challenge with social license to operate. There is from the risk mitigation standpoint, from the cost standpoint, and from the social license to operate standpoint, energy companies need to be thinking into the future. just a little bit. And I think that's the opportunity to really work with them. And I think this is very much about working with, not against, the different interests on a landscape. And I was just at a conference actually in California 2 weeks ago, and there was a lot of studies about solar installations and its impact, for example, on wildlife. And so you could install a great big block of a solar field and completely block wildlife from moving through that whole area anymore. Or you could stagger those, installations so that there's spacing in between so that wildlife can actually move through. And there are groups that are studying what kind of spacing you might need to do that. Similarly with agrivoltaics, how do we integrate agriculture and different forms of energy development? So I think it really, I think if we take less of an either or and more of a how do we integrate these most responsibly, not just on one piece of land, but on all the lands in a given area. And so you could imagine if you were thinking you're going to run a hunting operation and then all of your neighbors around you put in solar fields and blocked all the wildlife movement, you have a collision there, right? We've got to be thinking about how this works together beyond individual landowner lines. And to me, the strongest thing that landowners can be doing is working together on this. And we were involved with an energy development down in southern Colorado at one point, and the landowners banded together. They all signed an MOU. They agreed in that MOU to develop an area best management plan. That way they could all say which values they most cared about in their community that could be at risk in the face of the development. They could work together to design how that energy could be structured on the landscape and still take care of those other values, including agriculture and wildlife. And then the idea was that they would then tier individual leases to that area best management plan. And it put them in a position of better negotiating leverage as well for the benefits. And you can also, there's a thing called host community benefit agreements, where, if you're negotiating as a community, as a group, with whatever, the other entity is, you can ask for concessions. This is going to have a very big impact on these aspects of our community. We need to work out something that will help make us whole in that regard. I think the real challenge comes when landowners get picked off individually. And this kind of goes in all cases, all kinds of different developments and impacts on a landscape. But when you can create this collaborative local dialogue and start thinking about these things a little bit bigger than just property boundaries, good things can come of that. And so I guess that would be one thing I would really encourage people to be thinking about.
Great. Thanks for the question, Jen. And I do see some, Tom has elaborated in the chat a little bit, so we can get to his follow-up question, which is that consensus seems to be that NEPA doesn't work that well. What recommendations are you considering for improving the process, assuming it comes up in this Congress? Administrative recommendations or legislative changes?
That's a great question, Tom. We've poked around with NEPA on and off since inception of WLA. Over the last year or so, there's just been so much focus in Congress. It's been a really sort of fast-moving target. And so we haven't, gone deep in the very, very current debate that's been happening. You guys have seen Manchin and others involved in that at the federal level. There are some things that can be done in the administrative side. And given the difficulty of getting legislative change through Congress, we have focused a lot on the administrative side of things. And, with NEPA, I'm not a NEPA expert, so somebody with more NEPA expertise can jump in here and correct me. But there's a thing called like the NEPA triangle, which is like in the time leading up to the actual formal NEPA process. There's not really constraint on what you can do in terms of engagement. There's a lot of dialogue and working together and collaboration that can happen outside that formal structured process. So when you get to the NEPA point and you go into the formal process, you're actually well ahead of the curve. And that can be one way to expedite and come out with better solutions, as I understand it. Another one is that a lot of times it's the cultural clearances, actually historic preservation concerns that, there are clearances that create a lot of difficulties. And we're looking into the capacity of the state historic preservation offices, the SHPOs, to be able to respond to the requirements for those cultural clearances. And looking at, are there some programmatic approaches to doing those clearances based either on modeling or on known data that can be referenced. So there's ways that you can expedite the actual survey work, which would be helpful. I don't know that the page limitations are all that helpful, or even the time limitations necessarily, although it's the time length that people are so concerned about. So I think there's a lot capacity-wise, process-wise, that could be done on the administrative side without having to rejigger it statutorily. I'll pause there and see if others would like to jump in with ideas about statutory change on NEPA.
No one on the call is willing to just jump in with their suggestions for statutory change. I'm just on this bedrock of our current environmental policy, national environmental policy. It's a thorny one. So we literally, if you've got a great idea for statutory change, we'd love to hear it and talk with you about it. I think there's maybe, I think that brings us to the end of the questions. I don't see anyone else's hand up.
Okay.
So maybe it's a good time now, Tracy, to go to a little bit of the wonky nitty gritty of like who we're talking to and where our leverage points are in this Congress, in this upcoming Congress.
Yeah. So I just, really quick wanted to touch on some of the key committees that we're looking at. And, part of our strategy is really going to be to build relationships with those policymakers. And, some of you likely already have some relationships with some of these policymakers. So engaging you all moving forward is going to be a key part of doing that. But when we think about some of the committees we'll be looking at, of course, the Senate and House Agriculture Committee are an important one if we're going to be looking at Farm Bill conservation title recommendations that we have. And, there isn't a lot of representation from the West on the Senate and House Ag committees, but on the Senate side, there's definitely Senator Bennett and Senator Lujan. Bennett from Colorado and Lujan from New Mexico. So, we have them on the Senate side. I don't have my list of people on the House side, sorry, but I know there's some on the House side too. When we go to the Appropriations Committee, that's going to be an important committee, especially when we're looking at the ACE Act, what does the ACE Act stand for? American Conservation Enhancement Act, which would provide the funding for depredation compensation. That bill passed at the end of last year, and it's going to be really important to get that appropriated. So, on the Senate and House Appropriations Committee members, where we have some Western representation, you've got Patty Murray from Washington, who's the vice chair, and you've got Jeff Merkley from Oregon, who's on the committee, and Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, who's on the committee. As far as the Republican leadership side of that committee, we don't really have anyone from the West necessarily. I guess if you go the 100th Meridian, we've got Fisher from Nebraska and Rounds from South Dakota and people like that. But, as far as really like Western representation, where some of this applies, we don't necessarily have some members from the Republican side of the aisle. When we look at the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, like they have the jurisdiction over Fish and Wildlife Services, and the House Natural Resources Committee too. And then the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, we've got Senator Mike Lee from Utah, who's the chair of that committee. And then, of course, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico is the ranking member. And they handle they have jurisdiction over all the public lands and water issues. So we'll certainly be wanting to talk to that committee about some of those issues. And then, as we were talking about potential for tax legislation, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee are going to be important. On the Senate side, Senator Crapo is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and then Ron Wyden from Oregon is the ranking member of that. And then on the House side, we do have Representative Simpson from Idaho, who is the chair of, oh no, that's back on the Appropriations Committee. Sorry, I'm getting my people mixed up here. He's the chair of the subcommittee that handles the Department of Interior. and has jurisdiction over those funding issues. So anyway, those are just some highlights. Those are some of the committees we want to focus on, and we'll want to engage you all in building those relationships. But I think why this matters for WL engagement is we really want to help our membership get up close and personal with all the delegation members from the West, but especially those that are on the committees that I just mentioned. And, really work with you all to lift up the exciting work that landowners are doing. So it elevates the importance of that work to how important that work is to their constituents, to the ag economy, and to the conservation of wildlife and natural resources. And then, we want to seek to invite those members and their staff out on ranch visits and site visits. I know you all have done this before, but we really want to get in a rhythm of doing that on a regular basis. And as well as, we'll be planning some DC-based visits too. So, we're going to continue to stay in contact with our membership through our newsletters, as well as direct email communication and about those opportunities that are coming up. But we also invite you to think about doing this on your own too, and then keeping us abreast of when you have interactions with your members of Congress. Building that relationship is really key to us, making sure we're keeping this issue alive and well and in front and center with them at regular intervals. So again, stay tuned, and just want to see if there's any more questions and comments on that. And I look forward to sending you all some follow-up information about our platform, as well as opportunities where we're going to look to engage with these members directly.
Go ahead, Leslie.
I'd love to just throw in something here. Back to the energy question. There's attractive offers being made for landowners to do solar, for example, and development and all kinds of other things. And we really, when it comes to keeping lands, the working lands of the West whole and healthy, so that we can produce food and take care of wildlife and people, the economic playing field is not level. We're really challenged to keep these lands open and keep people's livelihoods strong enough to stay out there. It's critically important. So, a big focus of our work is trying to get the economic stack in place to support these different lands. So, you might have a mix of solar and agriculture and, something to do with hunting or guest ranching. You got these blended sort of enterprises. We want to make sure that there's, all the tools available in the toolkit, so that, solar just doesn't sweep agriculture off the land, or that something else doesn't just, development doesn't continue to obliterate our incredibly priceless working lands that are a finite resource. So a really big part of our work is looking at what that economic stack looks like, and then what are the regulatory supports that help or hinder that. So as you guys are, going about your days and thinking about those things, we'd certainly welcome your input on all of that. All right. Bill.
Yeah, I know you're getting near the end, but you mentioned, well, Tracy, you talked about the video against the herd that you guys helped facilitate. And, I don't think these issues that the Smith family is dealing with is so much legislative. I'm just wondering how you guys address the diverse chemistry that exists in different offices of the same agency that yields remarkably different results. For instance, we have a wonderful, we could have a remarkable, positive, productive relationship with our BLM office, and someone 100 miles away in Montana can't do what we're doing without any resistance at all. And so it's a cultural issue and not so much a legislative issue. I'm just curious how we address this inter-office chemistry.
It's really, really hard. I can say that. I've spoken with a lot of federal agency leaders who, for all the best intents, have a hard time setting the culture that carries all the way down through the agencies, whatever that culture is that they're trying to set. I've been watching some really great work actually within the Fish and Wildlife Service, trying to come to a place that's more collaborative, that's more multi-species oriented, that's more engaged with landowners in a constructive rather than policing kind of way. That's a positive movement. Very hard, people, built their career around my job is to protect this one thing against all threats, and you guys are a threat. Like that mindset's hard to change. And there's different variations of mindsets as people occupy these positions. So it's very hard to change agency culture from the top. It takes a lot of leadership. I think positive engagement from the landowner community, consistent positive leadership is helpful there. But there's also things like keeping good folks in place, creating more of an advance in place option so that when you really get a good working relationship, you got somebody who'll be there for a longer time. There's like a handover memo policies so that when somebody does rotate out, that the great work that's been put together isn't just lost with that individual when they leave, and that sort of transcends. Other than that, it's human beings, right? And it's all about human relationships. And that's just something this country seems to be struggling with right now. So I think that from this organization, from all of you all, again, it sounds soft and squishy, but at the end of the day, like, relationships are what make or break everything in life, pretty much. They're what make it successful or not. They're what shape and influence people's thinking and decision making. And the more constructive that we can be in building those relationships and outreaching and having people be able to see us as human beings and seeing them as human beings instead of as, federal bureaucrats. I think that's one thing I do take issue right now in the current rhetoric is really, vilifying a lot of people, in our federal agencies. So, I think we just have to be really thoughtful about building constructive relationships and then staying with that. And then creating exchange programs. There used to be a program where you'd have some ranchers that would go intern with the Forest Service and vice versa. Forest Service would intern with the ranchers for a couple of weeks, and that's a good learning opportunity. We'd really love it if we could get some more training in our federal agencies so that if they're dealing with, livestock production, they know what a cow does. They know a little bit about agriculture and production, so that they're more fluent in that. And so I think those are some of the things that we could definitely be working on. And then I think collaborative conservation organizations that have been so successful in folding in federal partners continue to be really important. But again, if there's turnover in that federal position, that can go away overnight. I guess, Bill, there's not a magic solution there, but to do our best to model what it means to build and maintain those positive relationships, even when we disagree.
And I think I would add to that, Bill, not even, I mentioned the committees that are important and those policymakers too, but we should view all the administrative staff as policymakers. Administrative law has the power of law too. It's just as powerful as what Congress passes. And so when we're talking, I think getting them out to see what's happening on the ground is really, really important.
It is. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes they won't come out. It can be really, I want to just acknowledge something. It can be incredibly frustrating working with some of the folks that give us a lot of headaches, and there's not a great solution. And sometimes there's no solution up the chain either. There's just no one to turn to for help when you are stuck with a person who is not collaborative and who has it in for you or feels like they have it in for you. But maybe one path there is to really think about what is it that they feel they need to be successful. See if you can see the world through their lens and work that direction. But I acknowledge that.
I thought I saw that Talia had made a comment too about with renewable energy. This was earlier on, comes the transmission, and that is something that we are paying attention to as well. And actually, there is what was that? There's one thing that we're following right now, Leslie. It's the potential national designation for transmission.
Huge issue. The national interest transmission corridors. And you can look that up online and see the maps of where those are slated to go in. And I can tell you that the landowners in those areas are already really feeling that. And there's eminent domain being exercised. And there's some, there's just tough negotiations going on in that space right now. So again, I think a solution for some of the transmission siting is to get some community engagement and do our best to, leverage that community work to force siting of those lines that works, minimizes the damage and maximizes the benefits. You're only going to be able to really do that with collective action. And we don't always have right now state or county support or leverage from that. So I think that's where we're going to need to speak up as landowners quite a bit. And we're actually working on that right now and seeing if we can come up with some ideas. There's some really neat tools out there, actually, and we've deployed them before to help improve energy transmission or pipeline siting, linear infrastructure siting, where you actually take the community values into the mapping process and generate kind of what they call a least cost path for that transmission line. That's something that can be done, over and above the EIS. And they did that in Montana some years ago in a thing called the Misty Review Project. But they now, I understand, I talked to the guy that helped lead the Misty Review project recently, and they've got some new apps and things out that can actually help with some of those siting decisions. So I think getting engaged really early with neighbors and energy companies and transmission, companies really need to be thinking about that. All right, well, you guys are a silent bunch. Go get some coffee. Enjoy lunch. Please get in touch with us individually. We'd love to hear from you. Oh, I'm seeing some new things in the chat. Oh yeah, how to access the recording, Louis.
I will be sending a link with the link to the recording to everyone who registered. So
terrific.
Yeah.
And please call me. I'd love to get to know you all a little bit better. So just reach out, email, phone, whatever, and love to chat it up with you all.
Yep. And you guys are our experts, so send us your thoughts, please.
Yep.
All right.
Well, thank you. And I'll just, we have 1 minute left. So this is my opportunity to remind everyone that we do programming like this for our members because of member support. So if you are looking at the policy opportunities for Western working lands coming up and want to make sure that WLA can stay engaged, we rely on donations from our members to make that kind of activity happen every day. So thank you very much, everyone who has been a supporter. And if you would consider it today, we'd really appreciate it. And then thank you very much for everything you do in the landscape and the stewardship of the West that you all are engaged in. We very much appreciate that as well. And we'll be back in touch with more opportunities for policy engagement going forward. Thank you.
Thank you all.